5.5 years at the University of Richmond, have produced a number of these dramas all about civil rights and education in Richmond. We've also produced a museum exhibition and are working on 2 more, and we've got a digital archive called The Fight for Knowledge, Civil Rights and Education in Richmond. And the project I'm going to talk about today was one of our most challenging plays for reasons you'll understand. The instigator of this play is the guy on the right, Mark Person, who I had met the year before when we were producing a play that really discussed how Richmond public schools responded to Brown versus the Board of Education. And for that class, we read a book called The Color of Their Skin. And in this book, a man named Mark Person was quoted about the experience of being bused to a high school that had been all white, was integrated for a couple of years, and then went on to become all black. It's a very familiar story. And Mark said that it was one of the best experiences of his life. I thought, I really have to meet this man if he's still around and bring him to our class. And so I cyber stalked him and then phone stalked him until finally I made contact with Mark, and that turned out to be a wonderful decision because he came and talked to our class and was on the post-performance panel after the play we produced that year, which was called School. And at the end of the panel, he said, you know, next year, you guys really ought to think about doing a play about my high school, with high school, because it was a really interesting place to be and it's a really important part of history. So we did. And busing in Richmond, as elsewhere, was extremely controversial when it happened in 1970, court-ordered busing. And that year on the panel with Mark, we had the head of the school board at the time who talked to us, Louis Booker, about what it was like to have his dog shot and death threats issued to his family on a regular basis because he was supporting court-ordered busing. And here's an example of one of the protesters. When I first looked at that picture, I thought he was a Nazi, but in fact, he's warning that busing could lead to either Nazism, or you'll see that tiny hammer and sickle at the bottom of his placard, or communism. It's that dangerous. Busing protests included children. You'll see daddy is cussing, mama is fussing, all about busing. And even family pets. My buddy will not be bussed. So we had our students go and look at all of these wonderful archival images at the Valentine Museum, which is the Richmond History Museum. And we had them go and to VCU's special collections and look at the vast archive of letters pro and anti-busing that were sent to the school board. Here's an anti-busing letter. Here's a telegram that Richmond citizens sent to President Nixon protesting busing. And here's one of many, many letters sent by representatives of a PTA who were very upset about busing. And in the play that we eventually wrote, we had our students playing out a scene in which they represented the school board. Because our class was exactly half black and half white, and because we had lots and lots of roles, you'll see that when students are representing white people, they wear white shirts, and when they're representing African Americans, they have black shirts, and that's how you can tell the difference. But mostly we were interested in talking to people, alums of Wythe High School who were there during that busing era. So this was one of our first surprises. I talked to Mark and I said, do you think you have some friends who would be interested in talking to us? And he said, I think I can get a couple of people to come to your class. So we set a date, and I was a little surprised when I was running from one class to another, and I went on my phone and there was an email from a reporter at the Richmond Times-Dispatch saying, is it true that you're doing this class about busing and so on? And I said, yes, it's true, and yes, we're doing a couple of interviews. I opened my newspaper the next morning, and there was an announcement about the interviews that listed our email addresses as well as the address of the classroom. So when we got to class, there were over 20 alums from the busing era, and about half of them were white, about half of them were black, and they were all there ready to talk. They hadn't seen each other in over 40 years. And I should also say that one of the things that we have been really challenged by was the fact that the Richmond Public Schools have no archives. So we had absolutely no visual evidence of the change in yearbooks, which used to be all white, were briefly integrated, and then became all black. And we were really frustrated by this. But we were very pleasantly surprised when the alums brought not only themselves, but their stuff. They brought their yearbooks, they brought their tennis rackets, they brought their letter jackets, they brought their, prom invitations, they brought all kinds of stuff. And they really wanted to create an archive. And so Wesley Chenault, who was the head of VCU's Special Collections, agreed to start the Wythe High School Archive, and that became an important source of information, not only for us, but for future scholars. So one of these alums was Elizabeth Saline, who talked about what it was like to go to Wythe, to make the decision. She had been at one of those all-white private academies that were set up in the wake of busing, but she really wanted to go to a regular public school, and so her parents let her, and she became the first white girl on the cheerleading squad. And she was joined by Val Perkins, and they talked about their visionary teacher who integrated the squad. And we all thought, will this teacher still be alive? She must be 90 years old by now. Maybe she's passed on. We didn't find her that year, but the next year when I set out to do an exhibition about growing up in Civil Rights Richmond, it turned out that the teacher is now 60 years old. In fact, she had been a 21-year-old when she integrated the cheerleading squad. So here's the scene that our students produced about the black and white cheerleaders kind of coming to terms with each other. This is Robin Mines, who moved to the neighborhood that Wythe High School was in. It was an all-white neighborhood, and she had a cross burned on her lawn. So she talked about that experience, as well as her experience with Wythe Now. She and Val and Mark Person all run the Alumni Association, which is very, very active in helping with students get scholarships now, because it's a very, very impoverished high school. So we had dramas about what it was like for white girls and black boys to tentatively think about dating. We had scenes about what happened at the first Black History Day. This was before Black History Week or Black History Month. And there was a day that Wythe High School invited Geroid X, who was then the local attorney for the Nation of Islam, to come and talk. And he talked about, black students, look around you, look at the honkies on your left and the honkies on your right. And our students, none of them knew what a honky was. They had never heard that term before. And Philip Brunson, who you see here, filled them in a little bit. He had been going to Black Panther Party meetings while he was at Wythe High School, and he remembered that event well. And here's Shalia Jackson, who was a student who was elected to play Geroid X, and she was a very devout Christian, and she was incredibly uncomfortable, not just with saying the word honky, but with raising her fist in a Black Power salute. It was a really big thing for her to do. And behind her, you'll see members of the One Voice Choir, which is an interracial community choir in Richmond. They had approached us during the summer because they knew that we did these projects, and they said, can we be a part of this? So they ended up lining the back of the stage and creating the sound effects and sometimes songs for the production, and it really added a lot. Here's Wesley Chenault, the head of VCU Special Collections, and Wesley added a lot to the project because not only did he create the Wythe Archive, but he helped us really conceptualize our digital archive, the Fight for Knowledge, and he also led the post-performance panel. And what we've learned over the years is that who comes to the play is just as important as what happens in the play itself. And so the first person, of course, to come to the play that night was Mark Person, who had created this gigantic exhibition, which he put up in the lobby outside the theater, and it was all about those years. And so all of the alums came, and they gathered around, and they brought more of their stuff. We had so much stuff by this point, we barely knew what to do with it. And we also had students from VCU. We had elementary school students. We had people from the neighborhood that Wythe was in, and we had tons and tons of alums. So here is Shalia Jackson, who is talking about her experience acting in the play. Here is Elwood York, who was in school with Mark, and he's talking about the experience of being bused to school. And at first, when busing took place, they didn't have school buses. So one man, Royal Robinson, talked to us about what it was like to have to ride 2 hours every day to get to school from his neighborhood because they had to take public buses and transfer, right? So it took forever to get to school. Elwood talked to us about the experience of having the Confederate Angels motorcycle gang shooting at the school buses. I don't know, we've never been able to confirm the story. I later did an exhibition about bus driving in Richmond, and I talked to all the bus drivers that didn't remember being shot at in that context, although they did get shot at other times. And here is Meg, the archivist at the Valentine Museum, talking about using our archives. And most interesting of all for us, here's a student, Vazia Herman, who was a student at the middle school, Henderson Middle School, where we performed the play. And we had met Vazia the year before when we had performed a scene from our play there. I should tell you that Henderson has 700 students, 694 of them are black and 6 of them are white. And so when we performed our scene from the play, we did a talk back afterwards, and one of our students said, so what do you guys know about segregation? And one of the students in this entirely African American audience raised her hand and said, segregation is a bad thing that happened in the past, and we don't have it anymore. And my students were completely blown away, and one of them decided to start a class in the school, which she was able to do, and work with the students on creating digital stories and poems about their experiences of civil rights and segregation. So Vazia Herman read a wonderful poem that she had written, an autobiographical poem. And there she is, answering questions from the audience. And finally, to me, one of the most exciting things that happened was one of the cheerleaders on the squad, the former cheerleaders who was in the audience, raised her hand and said, you know, when Mark told me about this project, he told me he found out that he was quoted in this book. And I decided to read this book. And when I read the book, I realized that what I thought was just regular life, what we were really living through, was history, and it was really important. And to her and to the other alums who were there, I think having their lives acted out on stage gave them a really different perspective on what they'd been through. And I think that that's what the Living Newspaper Forum does so wonderfully. And that's what I really learned from Joyce these many years ago. And even though I said I wouldn't say this, I will say that I have not only been inspired, I've been positively imprinted by Joyce in everything that I've done since in my career, and in the way I think about audiences and moving between university and public and community, and the way I've learned that it's really possible that you don't just have to write academic books, but that you can also do exhibitions and films and plays and anything else that's a means of sharing history with a broader audience, and that it can be very powerful and exciting to do that. So, Joyce, I will always thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Laura. Our third speaker is Erica Harth, who is Professor Emerita of Humanities and Women's Sexuality and Gender Studies. Since she retired from Brandeis in 2006, she has done teaching in some non-traditional settings, including the State Prison for Women at MCI Framingham. She is the author of several scholarly books, as well as the editor and contributor to Last Witnesses, Reflections on the Wartime Internment of Americans. She has also had the chutzpah to write a mystery novel, Red Hill Blues, which you can find on Amazon. Erica.
Well, Joyce, you've done it again. You've brought us together. Yes. I just have to say, just very quickly, Joyce, this is another instance of how you bring people together, which is what you did in our Women's Studies program. And at lunch, we were recalling the 10th anniversary, the wonderful 10th anniversary celebration of Women's Studies, which, like this occasion, was one in which a lot of really interesting and distinguished feminists from Brandeis came back and attended the event and spoke. Anyway, I have Joyce to thank, and also Laura, for what I'm going to talk about, namely some teaching that I did at MCI Framingham, Maria mentioned it, which is Massachusetts State Prison for Women, because I had used drama in at least one course at Brandeis, but what I didn't know about until I learned it from Joyce and from Laura was about the living newspaper. So it wasn't until after I retired that I decided to try to apply what I had learned from them about the living newspaper to my teaching. And I have to say, speaking of your imprint, Joyce, that this event is so unlike other Brandeis retirement parties I've attended, including even my own, because of not only the form of it, but the sense of continuity, the sense really, and some of you have talked about it, of how one generation inspires the next, and how there's a feeling of, yes, our concerns may be somewhat different, but we're all learning from one another. And it's really just a wonderful way to celebrate your contribution, Joyce. So in the first course that I taught in 2007 at MCI Framingham on the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II, I chose as a final project the production of a play by local playwright Rosanna Yamagiwa Alfaro on the incarceration called Don't Fence Me In. And the students actually acted in that play for the final production, and we invited all the students in the prison education program there and the staff involved in their education department to come as an audience, and it was very well received. I should say, just to explain to you, that the prison education program at MCI Framingham, which was originally, I think, just sponsored by BU, but I believe now that other institutions have joined in. The prison education program allows inmates to apply, as they would apply for any college entrance, to apply for a degree program, an undergraduate degree program. And if they're released before they finish their coursework, they're entitled to matriculate automatically at BU and perhaps at other institutions. There's also, as I believe there is at other prisons, a GED program at Framingham. I had taught a number of first-year seminars at Brandeis on the incarceration of Japanese Americans, but more as what I would think of as conventional courses with papers, etc. For the prison course on the World War II incarceration, I used much the same texts as I had used in my Brandeis courses. But the course I developed for MCI Framingham relied much more heavily on student participation. We had a student director of the play, student actors, of course, and two narrators who wrote their own material and gave a brief historical introduction to the play at the performance. After the performance, we had two students leading the Q&A. After that course, that culminated in production of the play Don't Fence Me In, I decided that successful as was our production of that play, the students might become even more deeply involved in the subject were they to write themselves their dramatic production, and here's where the living newspaper comes in. I was very moved also by Jean Traunstein's account, Jean Traunstein, MFA from Brandeis, in her book, Shakespeare Behind Bars, 2001, of the extracurricular program that she ran at Framingham for 10 years. During this time, she directed inmates in 8 plays by Shakespeare. The students, of course, didn't write those plays themselves, but by acting in the production, they came to new understandings of Shakespeare and of themselves. I was also influenced by Joyce's groundbreaking course syllabi, in which she combines history with theatrical productions, of which I've had the pleasure of seeing, I believe, 2. With the example of Joyce's productions and Jean Traunstein's works before me, I planned a syllabus that would be centered on an original dramatic production written by my students as in Joyce's courses. I thought that the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was still insufficiently known by the general public, and that it would be of special interest to the inmates. In fact, twice in my courses on the subject there, when the students had learned enough of the history to understand the magnitude of the injustice involved, one of them, not the same one in each course, said, "At least we did something to get here." Now, I should just say parenthetically that my relation to this episode of history was actually quite personal, because during the last year of World War II, I lived on one of those concentration camps with my mother, who was a social worker there. So I'm one of those last witnesses in my book. Here's how I organized the original production at the prison. At the close of the first class meeting, I handed out a cast of characters consisting of a large fictional Japanese American family and a small group of friends, both Japanese American and not Japanese American. I explained that in the next week or 2, I'd be asking each student to choose a role which they would keep for the duration of the semester, except that I made a little exception and told them that at mid-semester, if they were dissatisfied for any reason with their role, they could try to swap with someone else in the class, but I don't think it happened. Assignments were to consist of diary entries by their character, the equivalent of short papers, and letters to short papers on the various aspects of the incarceration covered in the syllabus. Each student would write from the point of view of her character. So, for example, when on the West Coast rumors began to fly as early as Pearl Harbor that maybe the Japanese American community would be incarcerated, we could represent how a mother, a father, a child, and so forth might react. The history, with its dramatic turns and twists, lends itself to such a curriculum. For example, in 1943, the United States government asked men in the camps to volunteer for military service in World War II. Of course, some did and some didn't, and bitter divisions in the community resulted. In 1944, the government began drafting men from the camps because at that point they needed the manpower. Most men answered the call, but a strong draft resistance sprang up, and finally a number of resistors went to federal prison. After the first class and my presentation of the modus operandi, one student came up to me and announced that she felt she had to drop the class. "I just can't possibly do it," she said. "I've never acted before and I couldn't stand up in front of an audience." I really felt for her. At the same time, I glimpsed a very good student behind the mask of fear. One thing that's obvious to a teacher at MCI Framingham is the extreme lack of confidence in the inmates. Because I've never taught at a men's prison, I don't know if the same lack of confidence prevails there. But many of the women have been very dominated, and worse, by their men. Anyhow, I persuaded this student to give our class a try. And if she felt she couldn't stay after several more meetings, she could leave then. She agreed, and it turned out that she did extremely well and enjoyed the experience enormously. And at the end of the semester, she reminded me of how she had at first nearly left the class. Toward the end of the semester, in preparation for the dramatic production, I divided the students into editing groups under chronological, historical headings that became 3 separate parts of the production: before the internment, in the camps, and after the internment. Each part, of course, included various episodes such as leaving home and entering the camps, school, the controversies over military service, some disruptions and violence in the camps, so-called leave clearance to attend selected colleges and universities that would accept Japanese Americans, resettlement at the end of the war. The editing groups were perhaps the most challenging part of the course. Students had to get together in small groups, mainly during class